The rusty padlock fell to the ground with a metallic clang that echoed across the empty farmyard. My hands trembled as I pulled open the heavy wooden door of the shed, 18 years of questions about to be answered in whatever lay hidden in the darkness beyond. The musty smell of old wood and something else, something metallic and sharp, hit my nostrils as sunlight streamed through the doorway for what must have been the first time in decades. Inside, covered by a paint-stained tarp, sat the outline of something large, something my grandfather had locked away from the world and from me. 3 months earlier, I had been counting down the days until my 18th birthday at Riverside Children's Home, not because I was excited about becoming an adult, but because it meant I would finally be free from the system that had been my entire world since I was 6 years old. The morning everything changed started like any other. I was folding laundry in the basement when Mrs. Henderson, the facility director, called my name from the top of the stairs. "Christine Turner," she said, using my full name the way adults do when something serious is happening. "You have a visitor upstairs." I climbed those concrete steps, wondering what trouble I might be in this time, but instead found myself face to face with a man in a wrinkled suit carrying a leather briefcase. He introduced himself as Eric Gray from the law offices of Gray and Associates, and the words that came out of his mouth next changed everything I thought I knew about my life. "Your grandfather," he said, "has passed away and left you his farm. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. I need to know there are people out there who understand what it feels like to discover you are not as alone in this world as you always believed." I stared at Eric Gray like he was speaking a foreign language. Grandfather. The word felt strange in my mouth when I finally found my voice to ask the obvious question. I do not have a grandfather. I do not have anyone. Mr. Gray opened his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. "According to these records," he said, "your grandfather was Thomas Kelly. He owned a 200-acre farm about 3 hours north of here in a town called Milbrook. He never married, never had children that anyone knew about, but apparently your mother was his daughter, my mother. Another word that felt foreign after 12 years of not knowing anything about where I came from or why I had ended up in the system. The social workers had always told me that my parents died in a car accident when I was 6, that there were no relatives willing or able to take me in. Now this stranger was telling me that somewhere out there, a man who shared my blood had been living his life while I grew up believing I was completely alone. The farm," Mr. Gray continued, "is yours now, along with all the debts and back taxes that come with it." He slid a set of keys across the table. "The property has been abandoned for about 5 years now, ever since your grandfather became too ill to work it. He spent his final years in a nursing home, but he never forgot about you. He left specific instructions that if anything happened to him, we were to find you and make sure you knew about your inheritance." I picked up the keys, feeling their weight in my palm. They were old and tarnished, attached to a keychain shaped like a tiny tractor that had seen better days. "Why now?" I asked. "Why did he never try to find me before this?" Mr. Gray shuffled through the papers and pulled out an envelope with my name written on the front in shaky handwriting. He said this would explain everything. That night in my narrow bed at Riverside, I read the letter by flashlight under my blanket, like I used to do with library books when I was younger. The handwriting was difficult to make out, but the words hit me like physical blows. "Christine," it began, "I know you must be wondering why an old man you never knew would leave you a broken-down farm and a pile of problems. The truth is, I have been wondering about you every day for the past 12 years. When your mother died, I was angry. Angry at her for the choices she made, angry at myself for not being the father she needed, angry at the world for taking her away before we could fix what was broken between us. I let my pride keep me from claiming you when you needed family most. I told myself you were better off without an old fool who did not know the first thing about raising a child. I was wrong. The farm is not much to look at now, but it was your mother's favorite place when she was growing up. She used to spend hours in the barn with the animals, and she loved to help me in the garden every summer. There is a shed behind the house that I have kept locked since the day she left. Inside you will find the things she treasured most, the things I could not bear to look at after she was gone. Maybe they will help you understand who she was, and maybe they will help you forgive an old man who let fear and stubbornness rob him of the chance to know his granddaughter. The farm needs work, more work than I can describe, But the land is good and the bones of the place are solid. If you decide to stay, you will find that Milbrook is the kind of town where people still look out for each other. If you decide to sell and move on, I will understand. Either way, know that you were loved and wanted, even if I was too much of a coward to show you when it mattered. Your grandfather, Thomas Kelly. I must have read that letter 20 times before dawn, each time discovering new details that painted a picture of a life I never knew existed. My mother had grown up on a farm. She had loved animals and gardens and wide open spaces. I had spent my entire life in the city, moving from one group home to another, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots or feel like I belonged. The idea that there was a place somewhere that had been her home, that could maybe become mine, felt like finding water in the desert. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in the passenger seat of a Greyhound bus watching the city fade into suburbs and then into farmland I had never seen before. Everything I owned fit into 2 duffel bags in the overhead compartment. Henderson had given me $100 from the facility's emergency fund and made me promise to call if I needed help. The other kids at Riverside had looked at me like I was crazy for leaving the only stability I had ever known to chase after some fantasy about a grandfather and a farm. But I could not explain to them what it felt like to finally have somewhere to go, someone to belong to, even if that someone was gone. Milbrook turned out to be the kind of small town I had only seen in movies. One main street lined with brick buildings that looked like they had been there for 100 years. A diner with checkered curtains in the windows. A feed store with bags of grain stacked on the front porch. People who nodded and smiled when they saw a stranger walking down the sidewalk with 2 duffel bags, even if they were clearly wondering what that stranger was doing in their town. I found the farm using the directions Mr. Gray had given me, walking the 2 miles from the bus station because I had no money for a taxi and no idea how to call one anyway. The mailbox at the end of the gravel driveway was so rusted I could barely make out the name Kelly painted on the side. The driveway was overgrown with weeds and full of potholes that spoke of years without maintenance. The house itself was a 2-story white farmhouse with a wraparound porch that might have been charming once but now sagged under the weight of peeling paint and missing shingles. The yard was knee-high with grass and wildflowers that had taken over what used to be flower beds. Behind the house stood a red barn that leaned slightly to one side, and beyond that, the shed that had been mentioned in my grandfather's letter. Even from a distance, I could see the heavy padlock securing its door. I used the key Mr. Gray had given me to open the front door of the house, stepping into a living room that smelled of dust and loneliness. Furniture covered in white sheets gave the place the feeling of a museum or a tomb. In the kitchen, I found dishes still sitting in the sink, as if my grandfather had simply walked away one day and never come back. Upstairs, I discovered what had clearly been my mother's bedroom, preserved exactly as she had left it decades ago. A twin bed with a patchwork quilt, a dresser topped with photographs of horse and blue ribbons from county fairs, a bookshelf filled with stories about girls who lived on farms and had adventures with their animals. I sat on the edge of that bed and tried to imagine the woman who had slept there as a child, tried to picture her face and hear her voice, but all I had were the fragments my grandfather had shared in his letter. That first night I lay in my mother's old bed listening to the sounds of the countryside. No traffic, no sirens, no voices from other rooms. Just the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant call of an owl somewhere in the darkness. For someone who had spent her entire life surrounded by the constant noise of institutional living, the silence was both peaceful and terrifying. The next morning, I walked the property to get a sense of what I had inherited. 200 acres of farmland that had been left to grow wild, fences that needed repair, outbuildings that needed new roofs and fresh paint, a well that still produced clean water, and a generator that sputtered to life when I figured out how to start it. The barn was in better shape than it looked from the outside, with solid bones that could support the weight of renovation if I could figure out how to afford it. But it was the shed that drew my attention again and again. Every time I walked past it, I found myself staring at that padlock, wondering what my grandfather had felt was too precious or too painful to leave unlocked. The key to that padlock was not among the ones Mr. Gray had given me, which meant my grandfather had hidden it somewhere or taken it with him to his grave. On my third day at the farm, I walked into town to buy groceries and supplies with the last of my money. The woman behind the counter at the general store, a friendly lady named Joyce Myers, looked at me with the kind of curiosity that small-town people reserve for strangers. "You must be Tom Kelly's granddaughter," she said as she rang up my purchases. "Word travels fast around here. I'm sorry for your loss, honey. Your grandfather was a good man who went through some hard times." I thanked her and started to leave, but she called after me. "If you need anything," she said, "anything at all, you just let us know. Tom helped a lot of folks in this town over the years, and we do not forget that kind of thing." Walking back to the farm, I thought about what Joyce Myers had said. My grandfather had helped people. He had been part of a community, had neighbors who remembered him fondly and were willing to extend that kindness to me. It was more family than I had ever known, even if they were strangers. That afternoon, I decided I could not wait any longer to solve the mystery of the locked shed. I searched the house from top to bottom, looking for a spare key or some clue about where my grandfather might have hidden it. In his bedroom, I found a wooden box on the dresser filled with old photographs and papers. Most of the pictures were of the farm in better days, with crops growing in neat rows and animals grazing in green pastures. But at the bottom of the box, I found what I was looking for: a small brass key taped to the back of a photograph of a young woman standing in front of the barn. She had dark hair like mine and the same stubborn chin that stared back at me from mirrors. On the back of the photograph, someone had written Sarah Kelly, age 16, my mother. I held that key in my palm and stared at the picture of my mother for a long time, trying to memorize her face and imagine what her voice might have sounded like when she laughed. Then I walked outside to the shed, my heart pounding with anticipation and fear about what I might find inside. The key turned easily in the old padlock, as if it had been waiting all these years for me to find it. The door swung open with a creak that spoke of long disuse, and I stepped into the dim interior, letting my eyes adjust to the filtered light coming through dirty windows. What I found inside took my breath away. The shed was not a storage building at all, but a workshop. Every inch of wall space was covered with shelves holding hand-carved wooden toys. Horses and cows and pigs, each one painted with careful attention to detail. Dollhouses with tiny furniture inside. Rocking chairs small enough for children to use. And in the center of the room, covered by that paint-stained tarp I had glimpsed from the doorway, sat a wooden rocking horse so beautiful it looked like something from a fairy tale. I pulled the tarp away completely and gasped. The horse was painted white with a flowing mane and tail, and its saddle was decorated with intricate flowers and vines. A small brass plate attached to the base read, "For Christine, with love from Grandpa Tom." He had made it for me. This man I had never met, who had let pride and grief keep him from claiming me when I needed him most, had spent years carving a rocking horse for a granddaughter he had never held. I ran my fingers over the smooth wood and felt tears streaming down my face for the grandfather I would never know and the childhood we had both lost. But the rocking horse was not the only thing in the shed made specifically for me. On a workbench in the corner, I found a wooden jewelry box with my name carved into the lid, and inside it, a letter in my grandfather's handwriting. "Christine, if you are reading this, it means you found the key and you decided to stay long enough to explore what I left for you. Everything in this shed was made with love, most of it for children in town whose families could not afford store-bought toys. I started woodworking after your mother left home, partly to keep my hands busy, and partly because creating something beautiful seemed like the only way to fight back against all the ugliness in the world. The rocking horse was the first thing I made after I learned about you. I worked on it every day for 2 years, imagining the little girl who would ride it someday, hoping that somehow I would find the courage to bring you home where you belonged. I never did find that courage, but I never stopped hoping that someday you would find your way here and know that you were wanted. If you decide to stay and try to make a go of the farm, you should know that the land is good, but the debts are real. The bank holds a mortgage that is 3 months behind, and the county is threatening to foreclose for back taxes. I have left what money I had in an account at First National Bank downtown, but it will not be enough to save the place without hard work and probably some help from neighbors who remember what this farm used to be. If you decide to sell and move on, I hope you will take the rocking horse with you as a reminder that somewhere in this world, An old man loved you enough to spend 2 years carving your dreams into wood. Either way, know that you are stronger than you think you are and braver than you know. You have your mother's heart and her stubborn streak, and those qualities will serve you well whatever you choose to do with your life. All my love, Grandpa Tom. I sat in that workshop surrounded by the evidence of my grandfather's love and skill, holding a letter that felt like a conversation with a ghost. Outside, the sun was setting over farmland that belonged to me now, land that my mother had loved and my grandfather had worked until age and illness forced him to let it go. For the first time in my life, I was somewhere that felt like home, but it was a home that came with more challenges than I knew how to handle. That night, I called Eric Gray from the phone in my grandfather's kitchen and asked him to explain exactly what I was facing financially. The numbers were sobering: $20,000 in back taxes, $30,000 still owed on the mortgage, credit card debt from my grandfather's medical expenses, equipment that needed repair or replacement before the farm could be productive again. But there was also the account my grandfather had mentioned, containing $15,000 he had saved over the years. And there was the land itself, which Eric Gray estimated could be worth close to $200,000 if sold to developers who were eyeing the area for suburban expansion. You could sell, he told me over the phone, pay off the debts, pocket what is left, and start fresh somewhere else with a nice nest egg. I could sell. It would be the smart thing to do, the practical choice that would give me financial security and freedom to go anywhere I wanted. But as I looked around the kitchen, where my mother had eaten breakfast as a child, where my grandfather had sat alone for years thinking about the granddaughter he had been too proud to claim, I knew I could not walk away from the only real home I had ever known. The next morning, I walked into town and introduced myself to the bank manager, a stern-looking woman named Ashley Miller who had clearly been expecting me. She looked over my grandfather's account and the farm's financial situation with the practiced eye of someone who had seen too many family farms fail to survive in the modern economy. "You are 18 years old," she said, looking at me over the top of her reading glasses. "You have no credit history, no farming experience, and no collateral beyond a property that is already mortgaged to the hilt. What makes you think you can succeed where your grandfather failed?" It was a fair question, one I had been asking myself since I decided to stay. "I do not know if I can succeed," I told her honestly, "but I know I have to try. This farm was my mother's home, and it is the only connection I have to my family. I am not ready to give up on it yet." Ashley Miller studied me for a long moment, then pulled out a calculator and started running numbers. "If you can come up with $5,000 to bring the mortgage current," she said finally, "I can give you 6 months to prove you can make the payments. But if you miss even one payment after that, the bank will have no choice but to foreclose. $5,000 might as well have been $5 million for someone with $15 in her pocket and no job prospects." But I shook Ashley Miller's hand and promised I would find a way to make it work. Walking back to the farm, I tried to think of ways to raise that kind of money quickly. I could sell some of my grandfather's woodworking tools, but they would not bring enough to make a real difference. I could get a job in town, but minimum wage work would never generate $5,000 in the time I had available. It was Joyce Myers at the general store who gave me the idea that changed everything. I had stopped in to buy bread and milk with my dwindling cash when she asked how I was settling in at the farm. "It must be lonely out there all by yourself," she said. "Your grandfather was always so proud of that place, especially the workshop where he made toys for half the children in town. My own granddaughter still has the dollhouse he carved for her 5th birthday." That was when it hit me. The workshop full of beautiful handmade toys, the skill my grandfather had spent years developing, the community of people who remembered his work and valued what he had created. I spent the next 3 days photographing every item in the workshop and writing descriptions of the craftsmanship that had gone into each piece. Then I drove to the library in the county seat and used their computer to create listings on online auction sites, describing the toys as the final collection of a master craftsman from a small farming community. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People from all over the country bid on my grandfather's work, drawn by the combination of skilled craftsmanship and the story behind each piece. The rocking horse alone sold for $3,000 to a collector in California who specialized in handmade children's furniture. By the end of the week, I had raised over $8,000, enough to bring the mortgage current and have a little left over for immediate repairs. But selling my grandfather's work felt like selling pieces of my family history, and I knew I could not sustain the farm by liquidating everything he had left behind. I needed to find a way to make the land productive again, to honor his legacy by making the farm a working operation that could support itself. That was when I met Kevin Cruz. I was in the barn trying to figure out what equipment was salvageable when a pickup truck pulled into the yard and a man about my grandfather's age climbed out. He was wearing work clothes and a baseball cap, and he approached the barn with the easy confidence of someone who belonged on a farm. "You must be Tom's granddaughter," he said, extending a calloused hand. "I am Kevin Cruz. I farm the land next to yours, and I have been wondering when someone would show up to deal with this place." He looked around the barn with the practiced eye of someone who knew what he was seeing. "Your grandfather had good equipment," he said, "but it has been sitting too long without maintenance. Most of it can be fixed, but it will take time and money you probably do not have." I explained my situation honestly, telling Kevin about the mortgage deadline and my complete lack of farming experience. He listened without judgment, nodding occasionally as if he had heard similar stories before. "Tell you what," he said when I finished, "I have been looking for additional land to expand my operation. What if we worked out a partnership? I provide the equipment and expertise to get your fields productive again, and we split the profits from whatever we can grow. It would not make you rich, but it might generate enough income to keep the bank happy while you figure out your long-term plans." It was not the independence I had imagined when I decided to keep the farm, but it was a lifeline that could keep me from losing everything before I had a chance to learn what I was doing. I shook Kevin Cruz's hand and felt like I was taking the first real step toward building a life in Milbrook. Over the next few weeks, Kevin Cruz became my teacher and mentor in the complicated business of farming. He showed me how to read the soil and understand what crops would thrive in different fields. He taught me to operate the tractors and other equipment my grandfather had left behind, patiently explaining the mechanical basics that would help me maintain the machinery and recognize when something needed professional repair. But more than that, Kevin introduced me to the community of farmers and neighbors who had known my grandfather and were willing to extend their friendship to me. There was Wayne White, who ran the feed store and extended me credit when I needed supplies. Jeremy Chavez, who owned the equipment repair shop and charged me cost for parts instead of full retail. Kimberly Bailey, who taught school in town and invited me to join the book club that met at the library every Thursday evening. For the first time in my life, I was part of a community where people knew my name and cared about what happened to me. When I mentioned that the farmhouse needed a new roof, 3 neighbors showed up the following Saturday with tools and materials, refusing to accept payment beyond the lunch I provided. When my grandfather's old truck broke down on the side of the road, Wayne White drove out to help me get it started and followed me home to make sure I made it safely. It was the kind of support system I had never experienced in the group homes and institutions where I had grown up. There you learn to be self-sufficient because depending on others usually led to disappointment. Here, interdependence was not just expected but necessary for survival. Farmers helped each other because they understood that the challenges of rural life were too big for any one person to handle alone. As summer turned to fall, the partnership with Kevin Cruz began to pay off. The corn we had planted in the spring yielded better than expected, and the soybeans in the south field brought a good price at market. For the first time since arriving in Milbrook, I was able to make a full mortgage payment and still have money left over for groceries and basic maintenance around the farm. But the real breakthrough came when I decided to restart my grandfather's woodworking business. I had kept a few pieces from his collection, including the jewelry box he had made for me and a small carved horse that reminded me of my mother. Looking at them every day, I began to understand the satisfaction he must have felt in creating something beautiful and useful with his own hands. I started experimenting with the tools in his workshop, following patterns I found in his notebooks and trying to replicate the techniques that had made his work so special. My first attempts were clumsy and rough, nothing like the smooth perfection of my grandfather's craftsmanship. But Kelly Parker, who ran the craft store downtown, encouraged me to keep trying. She offered to sell my work on consignment, explaining that there was always demand for handmade items, especially pieces with a story behind them. The first toy I sold was a simple wooden truck that took me 3 tries to get right. A young father bought it for his son's birthday, telling Kelly Parker that he wanted something special, something that would last long enough to pass down to the next generation. When she told me that story, I understood why my grandfather had spent so many hours in that workshop. He had not just been making toys, he had been creating heirlooms, pieces that would carry love from one generation to the next. As word spread about the return of Tom Kelly's granddaughter and the revival of his woodworking tradition, orders began to come in from people throughout the county. A grandmother who wanted a dollhouse for Christmas, a couple expecting their first child who commissioned a rocking horse, parents looking for birthday gifts that would be treasured rather than forgotten. Working in my grandfather's shop, using his tools and following his techniques, I felt closer to him than I ever had reading his letters or walking through his house. Every piece of wood I shaped was a conversation with the man who had loved me from a distance. Every completed project a way of honoring his memory while building my own future. By winter, I was earning enough from woodworking to cover my living expenses, while the farm income went toward mortgage payments and property taxes. It was not an easy life, but it was a sustainable one. And more importantly, it was mine. The transformation was not just financial. Living on the farm, working with my hands, being part of a community that valued hard work and mutual support had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. The angry, defensive teenager who had aged out of the foster system had been replaced by someone who knew how to accept help gracefully and offer it in return. Someone who understood that belonging was not something you were born into, but something you earned through commitment and care. Spring brought new challenges and new opportunities. Kevin Cruz suggested we expand our crop rotation to include vegetables that could be sold at the farmer's market in the county seat. The initial investment in seeds and equipment was substantial, but the potential profit margins were much higher than traditional grain crops. I threw myself into learning about organic farming techniques and sustainable agriculture, reading everything I could find and attending workshops offered by the Agricultural Extension Office. The work was physically demanding, but there was something deeply satisfying about watching seeds I had planted, gutted with my own hands, grow us into healthy plants that would feed families throughout the region. The farmer's market became my Saturday routine, setting up a booth that featured both fresh produce and my handmade wooden toys. Customers were drawn by the story of the young woman who had inherited her grandfather's farm and was working to restore it to productivity. Many of them became regular customers who looked forward to seeing what new vegetables I had available or what toys I had completed during the week. But it was at the farmer's market that I met Thomas Kelly, no relation to my grandfather despite sharing his name, who would become both a challenge and an unexpected ally. Thomas was a developer who had been buying farmland throughout the county, converting it into suburban housing developments that promised city amenities with country charm. He approached my booth one Saturday morning with the kind of smooth confidence that immediately put me on guard. "You are Tom Kelly's granddaughter," he said, introducing himself with a business card and a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I have been hoping to meet you. I represent a group of investors who are very interested in your property." I told him politely that the farm was not for sale, but he persisted, explaining that his company was prepared to offer significantly more than the land's agricultural value. The development they had planned would bring jobs and growth to Milbrook, he said, benefiting the entire community. What he did not mention, but what I learned later from Wayne White at the feed store, was that Thomas Kelly's developments had a habit of promising more than they delivered. The jobs were usually temporary construction work that went to outside crews, and the growth often meant higher taxes and strained municipal services that hurt longtime residents. The pressure to sell intensified over the following weeks. Thomas Kelly called regularly with increasingly generous offers, and I began to notice that other farmers in the area were facing similar approaches from his company. Some of them, struggling with debt and uncertain about the future of agriculture in a changing economy, were tempted by the financial security that selling would provide. At the same time, I was dealing with equipment failures and weather challenges that tested my commitment to keeping the farm operational. A late frost damaged half of my vegetable seedlings, requiring expensive replanting that ate into my profit margins. The irrigation system my grandfather had installed years earlier finally gave out completely, necessitating a repair bill that consumed most of my savings. There were nights when I sat at my grandfather's kitchen table, looking at the bills and wondering if Thomas Kelly might be right. Maybe the smart thing was to take his money and use it to start fresh somewhere else, somewhere without the constant pressure of mortgage payments and equipment failures and weather that could destroy months of work in a single afternoon. But every time I was tempted to give up, something would happen to remind me why I had chosen to stay. Kevin Cruz would stop by with advice about dealing with the irrigation problem, or Joyce Myers would mention how much she enjoyed seeing the farm productive again, or a customer at the farmer's market would tell me how much their child treasured the wooden toy I had made. The crisis came in July when Thomas Kelly made what he called his final offer. $500,000 for the farm, enough to pay off all debts and leave me with more money than I had ever imagined having. He gave me 1 week to decide, explaining that his investors were growing impatient and would move on to other opportunities if I continued to refuse. That week was the longest of my life. I walked every inch of the farm, trying to imagine it covered with houses and strip malls instead of crops and pastures. I sat in my grandfather's workshop, surrounded by his tools and my own unfinished projects, wondering if I had the right to make decisions that would affect not just my future, but the character of the entire community. The answer came from an unexpected source. I was cleaning out the attic of the farmhouse, looking for anything valuable that could be sold to help with the irrigation repairs, when I found a trunk that had been pushed into the far corner under the eaves. Inside, beneath layers of tissue paper and mothballs, I discovered my mother's wedding dress and a collection of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The letters were correspondence between my mother and my grandfather during the years after she left home, and reading them was like eavesdropping on a conversation that had been interrupted by death. In her own words, I finally learned the story of why she had left Milbrook and why my grandfather had been too proud to bring me home after she died. My mother had fallen in love with a man my grandfather disapproved of, someone he considered irresponsible and unreliable. When she announced her intention to marry this man and move to the city, my grandfather had given her an ultimatum: choose the farm and family, or choose him and never come back. She chose love, and my grandfather, wounded by what he saw as rejection of everything he had worked to build, told her she was no longer welcome in his house. They had maintained a correspondence over the years, my mother writing about her life in the city and my grandfather responding with news from the farm, but the relationship remained strained and formal. When my parents died in the car accident, my grandfather's first instinct had been to claim me immediately. But the social workers, seeing only an elderly man with no experience raising children and no family support system, had questioned his ability to provide adequate care. Faced with the possibility of a lengthy legal battle and uncertain about his own capabilities, my grandfather had convinced himself that I would be better off in the system than on a failing farm with a bitter old man who did not know how to love. The last letter in the collection was one my mother had written but never sent, found among her belongings after the accident and forwarded to my grandfather by the lawyer handling her estate. In it, she had expressed regret about the years of estrangement and hope that someday her father would have the chance to know his granddaughter. I want Christine to know where she comes from. My mother had written, I want her to understand that she is part of something bigger than herself, part of a family that has worked this land for generations. I know you think I chose poorly when I left, but I hope you will not let pride keep you from giving her the roots I never had the chance to provide. Reading that letter in the dusty attic where my mother had played as a child, I finally understood what was at stake in Thomas Kelly's offer. It was not just about money or even about my personal future. It was about preserving something that had taken generations to build, something my mother had wanted me to inherit even if she had not lived to give it to me herself. The next morning, I called Thomas Kelly and told him the farm was not for sale at any price. He was not pleased by my decision, warning me that I was making a mistake that I would regret when the next financial crisis hit. But I had made my choice, and for the first time since arriving in Milbrook, I felt completely certain that it was the right one. The irrigation repairs took most of the summer and required a loan from the bank that would take years to pay off. But by fall, the system was working better than it ever had. Kevin Cruz helped me negotiate a contract with a regional grocery chain that would buy my produce directly, eliminating the middleman and increasing my profit margins significantly. More importantly, I had found my place in the community. The book club that met at the library had become a source of both intellectual stimulation and close friendships. The volunteer fire department, desperate for new members, had recruited me despite my complete lack of experience. And I discovered that I had a talent for emergency medical response that led to training as a first responder. By the time my first anniversary in Milbrook arrived, I was no longer the scared 18-year-old who had stepped off a Greyhound bus with 2 duffel bags and no idea what the future held. I was a farmer, a craftswoman, a community member, and most importantly, I was home. The second year brought unexpected challenges that tested everything I had learned about farming and community. A severe drought in early summer stressed the crops and forced me to make difficult decisions about which fields to irrigate and which to sacrifice. Equipment failures seemed to happen at the worst possible times, and the cost of repairs strained my budget to the breaking point. But it also brought opportunities I could never have imagined when I first arrived in Milbrook. The regional grocery chain that bought my produce was so pleased with the quality and reliability of my deliveries that they offered me a contract to supply other farms in the area, essentially making me a coordinator for local agriculture. The commission I earned from these arrangements provided a steady income that helped smooth out the seasonal fluctuations of farming. My woodworking business had grown beyond anything my grandfather could have envisioned. Orders came in from across the state, and I had hired 2 part-time helpers to keep up with demand during the busy holiday season. The workshop that had once been my grandfather's private retreat had become a small but thriving business that employed local people and brought money into the community. But the most significant change was personal. Jeremy Chavez, the equipment repair shop owner, who had become a friend and mentor, had a son named Wayne who had recently returned from college with a degree in agricultural engineering. Wayne was everything I was not when it came to farming, educated and experienced and confident in his abilities. But he was also kind and patient and genuinely interested in the sustainable farming techniques I was trying to implement. What started as a professional relationship, with Wayne helping me design more efficient irrigation and crop rotation systems, gradually became something deeper. He understood the challenges I faced as a young woman trying to make it in a traditionally male-dominated industry, and he never made me feel like I needed to prove myself or apologize for what I did not know. By the end of my second year in Milbrook, Wayne and I were talking seriously about a future together, about combining our farms and our skills to create something bigger than either of us could achieve alone. It was not the fairy tale romance I had read about in books, but it was something better, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared goals, and the kind of deep compatibility that comes from working side by side toward common dreams. The proposal came on a snowy December evening as we sat in my grandfather's kitchen planning the crop rotation for the following year. Wayne looked up from the charts and maps spread across the table and said simply, "I think we should get married." It was not the most romantic proposal in history, but it was perfectly us, practical and straightforward, and focused on building a life together rather than just celebrating a moment. I said yes without hesitation, knowing that I was not just accepting a husband, but gaining a true partner in the work that had become my passion. We were married the following spring in the barn that had been my grandfather's pride and joy, surrounded by the community that had welcomed me and supported me through every challenge. Joyce Myers from the general store cried during the ceremony. Kevin Cruz gave a toast about the importance of young people choosing to stay and invest in rural communities. Ashley Miller from the bank, who had become a friend as well as a business advisor, presented us with a wedding gift of paid legal services to help us navigate the process of combining our farming operations. But the most meaningful moment came when Wayne's grandmother, a tiny woman in her 80s who had known my grandfather since they were children, pulled me aside after the reception. "Tom would be so proud," she whispered, squeezing my hands with surprising strength. "He always said this land would find its way back to someone who understood its value. You have honored his memory and your mother's wishes, and you have given this community hope for the future." Standing in the barn where my mother had played as a child, surrounded by people who had become my family, I finally understood what my grandfather had been trying to tell me in his letters. Home was not just a place you inherited or a house you lived in. Home was something you built through commitment and care, something you earned through the daily choice to stay and invest in the people and the land that sustained you. 3 years after stepping off that Greyhound bus, I was no longer the same person who had arrived in Milbrook with nothing but questions and hope. The farm that had once seemed like an impossible burden had become the foundation of a life I could never have imagined. Wayne and I had successfully combined our operations, creating a diversified agricultural business that included row crops, vegetables, and a small livestock operation that supplied local restaurants with grass-fed beef and free-range poultry. The woodworking business had evolved as well, expanding beyond toys to include custom furniture and architectural details for the historic homes throughout the region. I had taken on two apprentices, young people from town who were learning traditional crafts that might otherwise be lost to mass production and overseas manufacturing. But the most satisfying development was the role the farm had begun to play in the broader community. We hosted school groups who came to learn about sustainable agriculture and the importance of local food systems. The barn had become a venue for weddings and community events, bringing people together in a space that celebrated both tradition and innovation. Wayne and I had also begun offering internships to young people working out of the foster system, providing them with job training and life skills while they figured out their next steps. It was my way of paying forward the support I had received, of ensuring that other young people would not have to face the transition to adulthood completely alone. The program started small, with just one intern the first year, but word spread through social service networks about the opportunities we provided. By the third year, we were hosting 4 interns each season, teaching them everything from basic farm work to financial literacy to the importance of community involvement. Some of them moved on to other opportunities after completing their internships, but others chose to stay in Milbrook, finding jobs with local businesses or starting their own enterprises. Each one who stayed strengthened the community and helped ensure that rural areas like ours would continue to thrive despite the economic pressures that threatened so many small towns. The success of the internship program led to recognition that I never sought but deeply appreciated. The state agricultural department featured our operation in a publication about innovative farming practices. A national magazine wrote an article about young farmers who were revitalizing rural communities. The governor visited during a harvest season and praised our work as a model for economic development in agricultural areas. But the recognition that meant the most came from an unexpected source. Ashley Miller from the bank called one morning to tell me that Thomas Kelly, the developer who had pressured me to sell, had been arrested for fraud in connection with a housing development that had never been built, despite collecting deposits from dozens of prospective buyers. "You made the right choice," Ashley said. "That man was not interested in helping this community grow. He was only interested in making money for himself, regardless of who got hurt in the process." The vindication was satisfying, but more importantly, it confirmed what I had learned about the difference between development that serves a community and development that exploits it. Real growth came from supporting local businesses and local people, not from importing outside solutions that ignored existing strengths and relationships. As I looked around the farm that had become my home and my life's work, I could see evidence of that kind of authentic growth everywhere. The fields that had been abandoned when I arrived were now productive and profitable. The barn that had been falling down was now a centerpiece of community life. The workshop where my grandfather had carved toys in solitude was now a training ground for the next generation of craftspeople. But perhaps most importantly, the house that had stood empty and silent for years was now filled with the sounds of life. Wayne and I had converted the upstairs into a comfortable apartment for ourselves, while maintaining the main floor as a gathering space for interns, visitors, and community events. The kitchen where my grandfather had eaten alone was now the heart of a household that regularly fed a dozen people. 5 years after inheriting my grandfather's farm, I found myself standing in the same spot where I had first seen the property, looking across fields that were green with growing crops and thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The scared 18-year-old who had arrived with 2 duffel bags and no plan had been replaced by a confident young woman who knew exactly where she belonged and why. The financial struggles that had seemed so overwhelming in those early days were now manageable, not because farming had become easy, but because I had learned to work within its rhythms and challenges. The farm was not just surviving, but thriving, generating enough income to support our family and employ several local people while serving as a model for sustainable agriculture throughout the region. Wayne and I had recently learned that we were expecting our first child, a development that added new meaning to everything we were building. The baby would grow up on the same land where my mother had played, would learn the same lessons about hard work and community that had shaped generations of the Kelly family. We had already begun planning changes to accommodate our growing family, converting one of the upstairs bedrooms into a nursery and discussing how to balance the demands of parenting with the responsibilities of running a complex agricultural operation. But we were confident that the community that had supported us through every previous challenge would help us navigate this new adventure as well. The internship program had become a permanent fixture of our operation, with a waiting list of young people who wanted to participate. We had formalized the curriculum to include not just agricultural skills, but also business training, life skills development, and community service projects that connected interns to the broader network of support that made rural life sustainable. Several of our former interns had gone on to start their own farms or agricultural businesses, creating a network of young farmers throughout the region who shared knowledge and resources and supported each other through the inevitable challenges of working the land. Others had found their calling in different fields, but remained connected to the agricultural community as customers, advocates, and friends. The woodworking business had evolved into something my grandfather never could have imagined, with pieces being sold in galleries and craft shows throughout the country. But we had never lost sight of the original mission, continuing to make toys and gifts for local families while training apprentices in traditional techniques that honored the past while embracing innovation. The workshop itself had become a pilgrimage site of sorts for craftspeople who wanted to learn about the intersection of traditional skills and contemporary design. We hosted workshops and demonstrations throughout the year, sharing knowledge that might otherwise be lost while generating additional income for the farm. But the most meaningful recognition came from the community itself. When the town council decided to create a historical marker commemorating the agricultural heritage of Milbrook, they chose to place it at the entrance to our farm, with a plaque that read, "In honor of the Kelly family and all the farmers who have worked this land with dedication and vision." The ceremony dedicating the marker was attended by hundreds of people from throughout the county, many of whom shared stories about my grandfather and the impact his life had made on their own families. For the first time, I heard details about the man who had shaped my inheritance, stories of generosity and kindness that helped me understand why the community had been so willing to support me despite my inexperience and youth. Joyce Myers from the general store told about the time my grandfather had quietly paid the medical bills for a family whose child had been injured in a farming accident. Kevin Cruz shared memories of my grandfather teaching him to repair equipment when Kevin was just starting out and could not afford professional help. Wayne's grandmother recalled how my grandfather had organized the entire community to help rebuild a neighbor's barn after it was destroyed by a tornado. These stories painted a picture of a man who had understood that individual success was meaningless without community prosperity, that the health of his own farm depended on the health of all the farms around him. It was a lesson I had learned through experience, but hearing it confirmed through the memories of people who had known him personally gave me a deeper appreciation for the legacy I had inherited along with the land. As I write this, 7 years have passed since I first set foot on my grandfather's farm, and the transformation has been complete in ways I never could have anticipated. The property that was once headed for foreclosure is now debt-free and profitable. The house that stood empty is now filled with the laughter of our 2 young children. The workshop that had been locked and silent is now a thriving business that employs 6 people and serves customers throughout the country. But the most profound transformation has been personal. The angry, defensive teenager who aged out of the foster system has been replaced by someone who understands that true strength comes not from independence, but from interdependence, not from protecting yourself from others, but from opening yourself to community and connection. I think often about my grandfather's letters and the regret he expressed about letting pride keep him from claiming me when I needed family most. I understand now that his regret was not just about the relationship we never had, but about the years he spent believing that strength meant standing alone, that asking for help was a sign of weakness rather than wisdom. The farm has taught me that everything worthwhile requires collaboration. Crops grow because of the interaction between soil and seed and sun and rain. Communities thrive because people choose to invest in each other's success rather than competing for limited resources. Families are built through daily choices to show up and care for each other, regardless of blood relationships or legal obligations. Our children are growing up surrounded by this understanding, learning from an early age that they are part of something bigger than themselves. They know the names of every family in town, help with farm chores as soon as they are old enough to be useful, and understand that their actions affect not just themselves, but everyone around them. The internship program continues to bring new energy and perspectives to our operation, with young people from all over the country applying for the opportunity to learn sustainable farming techniques while developing life skills and community connections. Many of them arrive with stories similar to mine, young adults who have aged out of systems designed to provide temporary care rather than permanent belonging. Watching them discover their own capabilities and find their place in our community reminds me daily of how different my life might have been if I had chosen to sell the farm and take Thomas Kelly's money. I would have been financially secure, but I would never have known the satisfaction of building something meaningful with my own hands. The joy of being part of a community that values contribution over consumption. The peace that comes from knowing exactly where you belong and why. The locked shed that once held so many mysteries now serves as our farm store, where visitors can buy fresh produce, handmade crafts, and products from other local businesses. The rocking horse my grandfather carved for me sits in our living room, where our children play on it every day, connecting them to the great-grandfather they never met, but whose love shaped the world they inherited. Sometimes I wonder what my mother would think if she could see what her childhood home has become. I believe she would be proud of the choices I made, proud that I chose to honor the legacy she wanted me to have, rather than taking the easy path of selling and moving on. I hope she would understand that I found the roots she never had the chance to give me, that I created the family and community she dreamed of providing. If you are watching this and you have ever felt like you do not belong anywhere, like you are completely alone in the world, I want you to know that belonging is not something you inherit, but something you build. It requires courage to stay when leaving would be easier, wisdom to ask for help when you need it, and faith that investing in others will eventually create the connections you need to thrive. The farm that seemed like such an overwhelming burden when I was 18 has become the foundation of a life filled with purpose and meaning. The community that welcomed a scared teenager has become the family I always wanted but never knew how to find. The work that once seemed impossible has become a source of daily satisfaction and long-term security. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what unexpected gifts have shaped your own journey toward belonging. Share this video with someone who needs to know that home is not just a place you come from, but a place you choose to build, day by day, choice by choice, relationship by relationship. Home is not about where you start, but where you decide to stay and invest your heart. Sometimes the most important inheritance is not money or property, but the opportunity to discover who you are capable of becoming when you finally find where you belong.